Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you to, is it okay? It resonates a bit. And thank you to the festival and all the staff for organizing this so well and so greatly, and thanks to the people of Perugia, if there are any among them here. It seems that we still have a few people who wish to keep international law alive, apparently. So, welcome. Thanks for coming. My name is Thierry Cruvellier. I'm the editor of Justice Info, which is a specialized news media on international and transitional justice. Maybe actually the only one that deals with these issues worldwide and that is run by journalists. So we have about 30 correspondents across the world who focus on any of these justice initiatives that take place in their own country after some form of mass violence. The media has been created and is owned by Fondation Hirondelle, which is a Swiss NGO that supports media in situations of crisis and conflict. Of course, these are special times for many of us in many different fields, and it is special times in our field too, because we moved from this post-World War II world order that was theoretically based on law, and we moved back to a world order that is much more, but seems to be based on the use of force. And so here's a very quick little picture of the recent events. You must have followed in the past year or two the International Criminal Court based in The Hague has issued high-profile arrest warrants against top leaders of a number of countries, including Russia, Israel, Hamas, let's say, as a movement, Myanmar, Afghanistan, the Philippines. At the same time, we've witnessed the rise of another court in The Hague, the International Court of Justice, dealing as well with atrocity crimes in Myanmar, Ukraine, Palestine, Syria, and Sudan now. So this has seemed to highlight the growing importance of international jurisdictions, but at the same time, we've witnessed a serious backlash with these courts, and in particular, the ICC, so the International Criminal Court, being attacked by the new American administration in particular, but not only, and including state members of the ICC have also taken moves that are not really in support of their own court. So, in the face of all this, there's been quite a serious conversation about whether international law is still alive at all, and if these courts, especially the ICC, would even survive the times we're in. So we have three amazing speakers to actually reflect on this and talk about their own experiences. Janet Anderson, who is our senior correspondent in The Hague covering the ICC as well as the ICJ. Sorry for using these terms where it's going to be easier, but now you know which one they are. Janet is maybe the most knowledgeable reporter at this moment in time on these international tribunals based in The Hague. She also runs a podcast on international justice. And yeah, she's been, thank you. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you.
Then we have Kate Gibson, who will provide us with a different voice, not a reporter's voice, but because Kate is a defense and has been a defense and victims lawyer before a number of international tribunals in the past 20 years. She's currently involved in some weird case about the leader of the Uganda's Lord's Resistance Army, which is supposed to take place in the absence of the very accused before the ICC. And we have Anna El-Hitami, who has covered something different, which is a different kind of justice process, I mean, which is what we call universal jurisdiction cases. So that's when countries their law allows themselves to try someone who is not from anywhere for crimes committed anywhere, as long as they are serious crimes like war crimes or crimes against humanity. And Hannah has covered in particular what is the most important trial so far against a former Syrian member of the Assad regime that took place in Germany, where Anna lives. So she will give us a different perspective on this. Janet, shall we start with you? I was really wondering, like, how have you been through these very recent times as a senior reporter covering these institutions for so long? Has it changed? Can you first give us a state of affairs in your view of the current international tribunals, how you see them in their situation today?
As you've outlined, I mean, these courts and tribunals have become a tremendous focus right now. When we were first starting, so 30 years ago, there were just a handful of us working on it. Now, everybody is interested, which I think is a good thing for people to understand. But if I take the current example, the Philippines, we've just had the arrest of the former president of the Philippines, and that means that a whole bunch of new media, all of the journalists based in the Philippines and a lot around the rest of Asia, have become suddenly interested in this court. Some of them have been long-term working on this as human rights people, but they have this, they now have to understand the court's procedures and what it does and what it doesn't do and what it talks about and what it doesn't. And then there's a whole load of other journalists who've never even worked in this field who suddenly have to get it integrated into their conception of domestic politics that they're mainly working about. So it's like the spaceship arrives. This is the analogy I always use. The spaceship of the ICC arrives in your environment, and you have to get your head around it. And that happens again and again and again, and you realize that we're still existing in the same world where fundamentally states run the international world, and the courts have only this tiny degree of power, but we all invest in it as journalists as like this extraordinary space that's going to make a change and going to do something. And a lot of the courts are long, slow, difficult. They're held behind closed doors. They're highly procedural. I mean, it's not great story material, let's be clear. You know, over the years, it's been difficult to find sometimes the stories. But, you know, this is the world that we're in. Does that help, or is there something else you want to ask about it?
Well, also, did you see, because we may first try to explain the crisis of these institutions with this external pressure to have them basically stop functioning, and the internal problems that these courts have had from the start. How do you see, as an independent external observer, how do you see this crisis playing out in The Hague, especially in the last few months?
I mean, it's a slow death, isn't it? It's not something that you can kind of point to and say, this specific thing or this specific thing. It's a number of different elements that go around, including, as you've mentioned, the sanctions by the US administration that causes huge pressure. But exactly where is that pressure? Exactly which elements is it going to cause problems to the court? You have Italy not arresting a Libyan who was visiting the country and putting him on a state plane back. Really? So Libya's now not going to work with an arrest warrant from the ICC and tries to find a way of covering that up. We have Netanyahu visiting Hungary, and Hungary saying we're now going to withdraw from the court. So it's kind of death by 1,000 pinpricks. Yet on the other hand, there's this constant application to the courts to try to make something happen, to try to get some form of redress. There are a constant set of people who are working incredibly hard on behalf of the victims and survivors of atrocities, and they are being so creative. Each time you look at the International Court of Justice, how can we use the Convention on Torture? Let's try this way, let's try that way. So you're kind of in this constant balance between, this is a mess, and it's not going very well, and the states are not supporting. Yet, on the other hand, tremendous individuals and tremendous potential for something to change.
And when it comes to the practice of covering it as a reporter, I mean, you've been there from the start, and it's interesting how initially courts were monitored by NGOs who would be sitting in the public gallery and take notes of the entire proceedings. And even us journalists were doing more like a documentation work and reporting, including having some highly comprehensive coverage of it. And that seems to have disappeared. We no longer see that. So I would like to have your sense of where are we, how do you work today?
Well, I mean, I've written a couple of handbooks for journalists and for NGOs on how to cover the courts, and I look at them now, and I mean, they're still online, and they're still kind of relevant, but they're not relevant anymore, because this doesn't seem to be the kind of work that anyone is prepared to do, to sit there day in, day out and cover, apart from, of course, Justice Info, asks its correspondents to do that occasionally. But the rest of the time, where are the people who are actually holding these courts themselves accountable for what they are doing? We are trying to do it, but it feels like there is a gap with our regular understanding and really questioning whether these courts are doing the jobs they should be doing.
And at the same time, on the other side of the spectrum, we hear about the role of journalists specializing in this field of work would be to become war crimes investigators, which is sort of the opposite trend today. How do you see that? Do you think that's what we should be doing?
What I see is that many of us as journalists really do care about the situations that we are encountering. We've learned more and more how to treat with respect the survivors, how to tell their stories ethically, and we care enough to try to get the material to the right places. Then there's been the rise of the open source movement and investigation, which means that we also, as journalists, have so much more to offer in terms of new techniques and new ways of doing things. But, and there's the but, at the end of the day, I believe that I, as a journalist, I am working for my audience. I am not working for the prosecutor. One of my roles in working for my audience is actually holding the prosecutor to account and to asking the questions. What are they doing? Why are they doing it? Why are they doing it badly? The same way as I'm holding the defense to account on occasion. Why are you doing? What are you doing? Why are you doing it badly? So I find it difficult to say that I should be an investigator of war crimes to offer to a prosecutor. I want to do my job for my audience and to explain what is going on the ground for that audience, on behalf of that audience, not document crimes for a court.
Thank you, Janet. Let me move to you, Kate, because you're going to have a different perspective on all this. As a lawyer arguing before these courts for 20 years, what have been your own reflections on the place and future of international justice institutions? And how do you feel? I mean, they're very highly criticized, the courts you're working in. So how do you react to the current situation? Should we close it down?
Not yet. I think the ICC has a role still to play. The International Criminal Court should still exist as a centre for justice, for truth, for accountability. The idea, the concept of a permanent international criminal court that can put alleged perpetrators of war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity on trial is a good one. It's a good idea. The problem that we have is that we need states to cooperate with the court, to agree to arrest and surrender and transfer accused to The Hague. Without that, we're blocked. It's all very good for ICC pretrial chambers to continue to issue arrest warrants against President Putin, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Commander Min Aung Hlaing, President Bashir. It's a completely different story for those arrest warrants to then be executed. For states to say, okay, if any of these suspects come onto my territory, I am going to arrest them and I'm going to send them up to The Hague. And that's the blockage that we're seeing at that point. And at that point, if we don't have cooperation from states, we're just a building in The Hague full of lawyers issuing pieces of paper that don't mean anything. So for me, we shouldn't give up on the concept of justice, but without a sort of broad-based political support, the court can't exercise its core functions.
But the court has choices in the way they organize their strategy. And in fact, they used to have some people to be tried because they would target mid-level commanders, for instance, instead of going after the leaders of powerful countries, which they can never catch, or almost never catch. So doesn't that kind of strategy, doesn't it make the court even more symbolic than it already is?
I think the problem we've seen with that approach is that the only people that the ICC has ever been able to get in the dock, the only people who have been on trial, are people who've been sent to The Hague by their political opponents. You know, we say you end up in The Hague because you lost, right? You lost the conflict, you lost the election, you lost your grip on power, and you were sent to The Hague by your adversary. Leaders don't send themselves to The Hague. Leaders aren't sending their own military and political leadership to The Hague. And because of that, the court becomes even more politicized and more political because it is openly being used as a tool by states to silence their political opponents. And then we get into these cycles that there's distrust in the court because all the states see that it's incredibly political, and so they're less willing to arrest the high-level suspects. And so we are now trapped because of those choices. There are alternatives. You know, Hannah's going to talk to us about other avenues for international justice, really focusing on building capacity to allow localized courts, regional prosecutions and investigations, encouraging states to use their own universal jurisdiction to try Syrians in Germany, Congolese in courts in Paris, you know, members of the Tatmadaw being tried in Argentina. And in my view, anything that sort of brings the justice process is closer to the affected community is a good thing.
You're referring to some kind of, the problem with the court comes from the outside. Fine. But we all know it comes from within as well. These courts have been dysfunctional. I mean, the ICC's record is abysmal in 20 years. And so everybody is aware that the problem is also from within and from also the way the court has been designed. And I mean, you're just back from Uganda, and I think it would be good that you share a bit of what you heard from the victims there and what they say about the prospect of having an in absentia trial of Kony, who is the leader who's disappeared of the Lord's Resistance Army. Because one of the problems we've seen is that they constantly claim that they are speaking on behalf of the victims, and they don't seem to ever listen to what the victims really want. They have their own idea of what the victims want, and that's what they implement, as opposed to listen to what they say. So I'm interested in you sharing perhaps 2 of your experiences in that respect. In Uganda, what did you hear? And in Myanmar, which is also a place where you worked with victims.
Okay, this is really interesting, well, I think. The ICC, as a strategy to try and get around the fact that it doesn't have Putin in the box and it doesn't have Prime Minister Netanyahu in the prison, the strategy that they've adopted is to move to what we call in absentia proceedings, so moving against accused even when we don't physically have them in The Hague. And the first experiment is a case that I've been assigned to represent the interests of Joseph Kony, who is the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army that engaged in a 2 decades-long brutal conflict in the north of Uganda against the Ugandan government forces that was really characterised by extreme violence against civilians and the abduction of children, and it was this horrific conflict. So the ICC has decided Kony's the target for the first in absentia trial in The Hague. And the reason that the prosecutor gave to the pre-trial chamber to ask them to make this extraordinary step that the court's never done in 25 years of operation, they said, the victims want this. This is in the interests of the victims' community in northern Uganda. So as the lawyers assigned to represent Joseph Kony, we went and spent as much time as we've been able in the last 8 months in the north of Uganda engaging with the affected community, engaging with victims' community, engaging with former members of the Lord's Resistance Army, engaging with members of Kony's family who've returned from the bush. And overwhelmingly, in fact nearly unanimously, the victims' community in northern Uganda is saying to us, please don't come here and do this. We have our own system, our incredibly sophisticated system of traditional justice in the Acholi region, which we have worked incredibly hard at engaging with and ensuring that we have had peace and reconciliation after 20 years of conflict. If you come here and run an in absentia trial against Joseph Kony, you're going to fan the flames of conflict, you're going to reopen wounds that we've spent so long trying to close. We've dealt with this in our own way. And so now it's our job to go back to the court and say, you've got the wrong idea. You're making these statements about what victims' communities want without talking to them, without engaging with them. And unfortunately, that's a pattern that I've seen. I have the privilege of representing Rohingya victims in the Myanmar situation at the ICC. And I think we're all very guilty at the court of saying very flippantly, we're doing this for victims. The victims want us to do it without actually thinking, do the survivors of these conflicts, are they interested in the resources being spent on predominantly a bunch of white people standing around in a courtroom in The Hague wearing ridiculous outfits, arguing for years on end about admissibility of evidence or individual criminal responsibility? My clients, my Rohingya clients, when I speak to them about what justice looks like, it's got nothing to do with what we're doing in The Hague. They're interested in reparative justice, in restorative justice, in a safe and dignified return to Myanmar, or food security, or education for their children. They have different views. You know, trying to paint victims' communities as all sharing one view of what justice and what accountability looks like is part of the problem. So I completely agree. As a legal community, we don't do a good enough job of engaging with the victims' communities and seeing if they're actually interested in what we're pretending to do in their name.
Thank you, Kate. Anna, you're going to tell us a different story which has similarities, because we actually still deal with justice that is very remote from where the affected communities are. But you've covered the most high-profile case so far against a former officer in the Assad regime that took place in Germany, the case of Anwar Raslan. And so that took place under that principle of universal jurisdiction that I was just referring to earlier. And these trials have multiplied in the past few years in different countries against all sorts of suspects. Can you tell us some of the lessons that you drew from that experience?
Yeah, so I covered the trial from 2020 to 2022, so almost every week. I think it was around 100 days in court. And I started out, I think like lots of other journalists, with kind of like a romanticized story about what's happening there, what's about to happen there. So the story that kept being told, and I honestly also told that kind of story in the beginning, was like, okay, so now finally Germany is bringing justice to Syrians by having this trial, the first trial to deal with state torture in Syria. And I noticed over the years and until today, the same story is still being told. Like it's always like Germany bringing justice, and there's always the same people being interviewed, the same survivors and the same human rights lawyers. And I want to also start by saying that I 100% respect these people. I think their struggle is really important. I think the work that they've done and are still doing is very courageous, so I would never want to discredit that. I think my problem is more like with the way that the media has kind of given this very narrow and always the same narrative. And that's the same narrative that the courts themselves and the government, the German government, is also portraying. So this is what I'm criticizing. Yeah, so after covering this, or while covering this trial for 2 years, you know, this narrative kind of came apart in my head. So first of all, you know, realizing that Germany is not the country that brings justice to other affected communities. Of course, it's always being argued because of Germany's own history. It's like the place that has learned how to prosecute those kind of crimes. But I mean, I think everybody knows that Germany is not doing that at all at the moment and very much discrediting itself in that role. But also at the time, I learned that universal jurisdiction is also a political decision. Like it's not unlimited. It's not like if I bring suspect to the German government or to the German judiciary, they're gonna prosecute. No, they decide if they prosecute or not. And very high-level CIA officers and other high-ranking officials from Germany and from the States have not been prosecuted in the past because they found reasons not to do it, but in the end, I think there was no political will. So some scholars also argue that universal jurisdiction only allows countries or states to go after politically low-cost individuals. So Germany has nothing to lose, I would say, by prosecuting a former Syrian general. I mean, nobody's gonna come in and protect this guy, not the ex-Syrian government, not any NGOs. He's gonna be assigned some, I would say, not that great lawyers that didn't know the context very well. Yeah, so I feel like this whole thing about double standards and political decisions is one of the issues that make universal jurisdiction such controversial tool in my opinion. And also you see that the courts are not very well prepared because they're German courts. They're not like an ICC. They're not dealing with international crimes all the time or different countries. So even, I mean, there were so many funny, even misunderstandings, just language-wise, and then culturally, and then I also felt sometimes that it's not that important to be very specific about evidence. Like I remember there was this one smaller Syria trial, not the big one, the big famous one, where I'm pretty sure that the attack that this was about happened, a war crime, but I'm not actually sure the guy who was indicted did it, because that was based on like 4 eyewitnesses who weren't even right there. They were like hiding in a building or somewhere around the corner, and this was like 12 years ago or 11 years ago. So I'm not sure that that kind of evidence would pass in a domestic kind of trial. So I feel like there's so much will to, to indict, and the crimes that are in question are so big and so horrendous that, that you feel like, let's indict that person. I don't feel like it would be easy to dismiss, and also there's nobody advocating for the defendant's rights in these cases, so I don't know where, that's what you just said, like holding the courts accountable. I don't see who would hold the courts accountable in this kind of setting. And maybe my last point, but one of the also most important points for me, was that in at least the Syria trial, but also another trial on Gambia that I covered, the people who were being indicted, or who were in the dock and who were then convicted, were at least defectors. Of course, just because someone defected at some point doesn't make them innocent, but 2 of them were very low-level people from the former regime or militias. They defected, I would say, as soon as they could, or in the case of the Gambia trial, the guy was a driver, and he got life in prison because he was, as a driver, participated in the killing and assassination of a journalist and a lawyer. But what wasn't really talked about that much is that he at some point defected. He even tried a coup against the former dictatorship. Then he left the country, then he went to the States, and he gave this really long interview to an opposition radio station where he uncovered all the crimes of the regime. So I personally would consider him a whistleblower. But then, because that interview existed and the guy was in Germany, years later, someone was like, oh, in that interview he actually mentions that he was there. That's why he is able to uncover those secrets. And so they indicted him. I think, this kind of guy, he would, in my opinion, or my experience, he would never have gotten life in prison in the Gambia in a proper transitional justice process, which they have. I'm not saying it's going very well, it's going too slow, it's not really, you're not sure if they really want to do it or not, the current government, but it's there. So why is Germany taking a whistleblower, putting him in prison for life? It just seems so lost in space, you don't see the political strategy, it's always just formalities, and somehow devoid of the bigger picture, which probably is also connected to the fact that it's just so far away from the affected communities. So yeah, as you can hear, I'm actually very critical of the universal jurisdiction practice, and now even more than ever, because Germany is not really proving itself as very consequential in their beliefs on international law.
Listening to you, it feels like covering these trials is like a school in disillusions.
Sorry.
It's back to a long time ago. I mean, Rebecca West, when she was covering the Nuremberg trial, was describing it as a fortress of boredom. So it's an old story. And yet we're doing it. Yet we're still covering it because we still kind of find it interesting, important, relevant, and exciting. They're real stories. So, Anna, what is it that you took from it that you actually enjoyed or found reasonably valid?
I would not agree with the wall of boredom. I thought it was very interesting, and I would love to cover more trials, but there aren't any very interesting ones happening in Germany right now. No, I think it's really interesting. You get to know so many people from the affected communities who are doing really good work, and you notice also they're not a monolithic block. So when you were talking about what do the victims want, and as you said, they aren't the victims. Some victims want this and some victims want that. So I think it's kind of a problem also that journalists are always interviewing the same victims, because those are the ones that were presented to them by NGOs, and then everyone kind of falls back on the same selection. Like I said, great people and important experiences, but just it needs to be a bit more diversified. But I would say the stories that you hear, the little details and the facts that you hear, the fact that you can get so much detail about something that happened without asking the questions yourself, because the court is asking them, questions that you as a journalist might not dare to ask or might feel uncomfortable asking, but everything's being laid out. So I think it's a lot of fun to work in courts, yeah.
Maybe actually it would be nice to hear Kate about us, because, you know, you see us, you meet us. What's your critical view of how reporters cover these institutions and justice processes?
I think there's a lot of scope for journalists and practitioners to be mutually reinforcing. If you read the judgments of these courts, of international criminal courts, you see how regularly judges rely on the work of journalists for their fact-finding. They rely on contemporaneous news reports and video footage and photographs, and often the testimony of journalists who will come to court and say what they saw and bring the information that they managed to capture in a way that is admissible before the courts. So that's fundamentally important for us. Also, you know, if at the centre of this work is whether or not it's helpful for the affected communities, for the victim communities, I think it's really important that they know what's happening in these courtrooms. I mean, I spent many years at the Rwanda Tribunal, the UN Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda that was set up not in Rwanda but in Tanzania, and it tried about 90 defendants who were accused of being responsible for the 1994 Rwandan genocide. And Thierry and Janet will remember each of the 4 courtrooms had a very small public gallery with about 3 or 4 rows of chairs. We would spend weeks, months, doing these trials to an absolutely empty public gallery. The Rwandan community was not following, you know, if Thierry hadn't been there, empty galleries. One Easter my parents came to visit, and it was such a big deal that the presiding judge welcomed them into the courtroom, and all the accused were waving at them, and they're like, what is happening? It was such a big deal to have people in the gallery. Contrast that with my experience at the Cambodia Tribunal, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, that was set up in Phnom Penh, and we had this huge gallery of 500 seats, and 160,000 Cambodians moved through that gallery in the first trial, and it meant that the journalists were there. Cambodian journalists could come, and so every day the Phnom Penh Post, the Cambodia Daily, was publishing what was happening in the courtroom, and it mattered because it meant that the people who were affected by the trials could follow them. And they did a study at the end of the Khmer Rouge court, and they found that 75% of Cambodians thought that the court would contribute to justice. And that's unheard of. That's sort of off the charts. So we need journalists to be coming to these trials and reporting on what we're doing. Otherwise, we're just acting to ourselves in a room, in a void, and it won't be helpful for the people who need it.
I can say that the trials at the ICC are similarly very lonely when you're in the up there watching them. There's practically nobody, even and that's at the times when it is actually open to the public.
So how do you keep your own enthusiasm? Because you're still enthusiastic about these things. You actually even developed a podcast on international justice that would seem not like the most fun thing to do. And
exactly. Well, of course it's fun.
It's not a citadel of boredom when you listen to it.
No, it's not boring because, as you can hear, there are all these actual fundamental big questions that are a constant part of our work. Plus, these are really important issues. I mean, you tell me genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes are not important. They're really important, so I really care about it. That makes a big difference. And the reason for starting the podcast was because I found that my contact list was mainly full of male lawyers who could easily comment on things, and I wanted to make sure that I expanded out and had more people who were not just the same old people commentating. And I think that this world I think we'd all say this world, we can see it's not kind of democratizing as such, but there are many, many more people interested in this world, and it's been great to be able to get many of them onto the podcast to talk about it.
I think,
Just add something
yes, of
about
course.
the question of journalists being able to cover or making it accessible to the affected communities, because I think one of the most criticized parts of especially the big Syria trial, the El-Hitami trial in Germany, but also others, was that it was not accessible. It was all in German. There was translation available for the defendant and witnesses, but not for the public gallery and not for the journalists. So journalists or any kind of multiplicators from the affected communities weren't even able to cover the trials, which kind of contributes to that whole, what I mentioned, like happening in a void. It's not going to change anything if nobody hears about it. And some of these trials, like the court also makes it really difficult to cover them because they don't tell you what's happening on what day, and you can't be there every single day because you can't afford that. So one of the trials that happened in Hamburg, I think there was nobody, and nobody covered it, and I think there's no information available. And one small point also is that the Syrian community there's a huge Syrian community in Germany, and they're very well connected, and they have a lot of funding, and they have a lot of civil society groups who did go to the court, and they speak German, and they covered the trials and kind of spread the word. But then with the Gambia trial, I talked to a Gambian activist, and she told me, Gambian community in Germany, it's very, they're not big, and they are not there, a lot of them are not there legally, they're being deported. They don't have the luxury of building networks, being funded, going to courts. They're just struggling to even be there or survive. So I think it's also really important to see that some communities don't have the resources to even be there at all.
Which is why you were so well equipped to cover it, because you could speak both German and Arabic. Now, on this point, the Dutch did better than the Germans because they had such a trial recently, and they did organize the trial to be in Arabic at the same time, so that the communities could follow it. We have about 8 minutes left, and I wish to give the floor. Well, there are plenty of hands raised, so I saw you first, then I'll move on. Is there a... Sorry, okay.
Collect a few questions, and then we just answer them.
What's that?
Collect 3 questions and then answer them.
Oh, you want to... Janet suggests that we collect 3 questions, so I have these 3. Please start.
Oh, you have to stand up, okay. Good morning. I'm Andy from the Philippines, but I'm based in the Czech Republic. And I was in The Hague for 3 weeks to cover Duterte and his arrest. My question is for Janet. Just wanted to know in your 30 years of experience, right? 25 years of experience of so the biggest dilemmas that you faced covering, international cases like this, high-profile cases, so at least we journalists from Southeast Asia would be able to learn from your experience. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and then the lady behind. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Patrick Gadara from the New Humanitarian. I live in Nairobi, Kenya, born and bred. I'm wondering about the legacy of the Kenya cases. A lot of what you've said about the courts being instrumentalized for people to take their political enemies there wasn't really the case with us, because, the 2 parties that went there actually took each other or reported each other to the courts. And it has had a legacy of kind of dampening the appetite for political violence amongst the political class. So isn't it the case that there is spaces where the ICC is actually useful and helpful as a court where essentially rulers and politicians can be afforded to?
Janine?
Hi, I'm Janine DiGiovanni. I'm the CEO of the Reckoning Project. We're a war crimes unit. We work with the ICC and also with the Prosecutor General in Kyiv. Question for Kate. We just filed criminal proceedings in Argentina in a universal jurisdiction case against Russian individuals for torture. So what is the importance of universal jurisdiction in the legality of it? Is it just messaging? Is it just to send a very clear message to perpetrators? And second small question, maybe for Annette, it's about double standards. Both Putin and Netanyahu have been issued arrest warrants, yet Putin is not comfortable sitting in Moscow. He's annoyed that he can't go to the Munich Security Forum. He's annoyed that he can't travel. Netanyahu, on the other hand, got a warm welcome last week at the White House. I know the US is not a signatory, but it's basically his scoffing at international law. He was in Hungary last week as well. So how is that, maybe Annette can tell me, the perception of these double standards seen at The Hague? Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to start? Janet, Kate? Kate?
It's a really good question. Is this push for universal jurisdiction, so domestic courts exercising their jurisdiction over crimes that weren't committed on their territory and weren't committed by their citizens, is it just symbolic? Is it actually going to end up with more people in the dock or people being convicted and sentenced? And this is the question. I think it is more than symbolic, and we have practical examples of that, particularly in Argentina, where we've seen that there has been the case brought on behalf of the Rohingya community against high-level members of the Tatmadaw, of the Myanmar military leadership. And yes, probably as far as that case is going to go is the issuance of arrest warrants. But that already is more than symbolic, because it makes it difficult for these high-level Myanmar perpetrators or alleged perpetrators to move freely around the world. It makes governments think twice before they engage in, for example, military training or the supplying of weapons, which Australia was still doing in Myanmar. So there is a sense of symbolism, because you don't often end up with the sort of trials that Hannah was talking about. But still, those arrest warrants, they mean something, I think. They mean something to the victims, and they can really stymie the ability of these leaders to move freely around the world. And maybe I'll go straight to the Kenyan.
Just a quick word, yes,
Very quick,
please.
because, and I'm so grateful to you for raising this, because this was the exception that proves the rule. We had members on both sides of the political spectrum in Kenya surrendering to the court, Mutara and Ruto coming to the court, and being on trial at the same time as they were also holding office in Kenya, which we in the court saw as some level of success. The end of that case was that the prosecutor withdrew the charges against all of the Kenyan defendants, citing essentially interference with witnesses. They weren't able to get it across the line. It was too politically fraught at the time in Kenya. So the ICC, I think, still views this as not one of its best success stories, but it was certainly incredibly interesting to have that dynamic play out, and I'm really grateful to you for raising it.
And what's interesting in a way is that what seems to be a fiasco, according to you, also led to political leaders being a bit concerned about political violence, which was a sort of strange positive outcome of a failed justice process.
Right.
Janet, we have 2 minutes left, and you were asked about the greatest.
Yeah, I would say the legacy of Kenya is that it taught the court that it can't work without good cooperation from a state, and it's taught the court that, the current prosecutor was one of the defense counsel there, so he knows extremely well how to make the system work. Did it produce less political violence? I agree with you. There's always an argument with these courts that they kind of shrink the space for denialism, and maybe they do that to some degree. Maybe they help to some degree, but I think we have to be very modest with what we suggest these courts actually achieve. Biggest dilemmas, I'll come back to you directly. Let's talk afterwards, because I do quite a lot of ethics training around this, and there are so many ethical dilemmas that you have. Maybe the biggest one, maybe you have it as well. I can't burn my sources. I have to actually maintain good relations with as many people as I can, and that can be quite problematic when I know how shitty they are actually as individuals.
In 15 seconds about the double standards, maybe?
15 seconds on double standards. Yes, they exist. They keep on going, and we need to keep on reporting on them and pointing our finger as to how skewed this system of justice is. It's not perfect. It's never been perfect. It will not be perfect, and that's our job as journalists, to point out what's going on.
And people are particularly annoyed about it in The Hague, or it's okay?
Mood in The Hague is one of chaos and crisis. It's palpable, I think, at the court. But this is all cyclical, and we're in for the long haul, so.
Because it's not only the US who are welcoming Netanyahu, also state members, Germany, France, Hungary, etc. Well, I think, unfortunately, our time is up, so thank you very much for being here, for listening, and have a good day.
Okay. Can I kindly ask you to leave the room as quickly as possible, because we have some police check for the next panel, so we need 10 minutes to check all the room. Thank you very much. If you want to make some interview, you can do it outside with the speakers. Thank you.